Hi there. Welcome back to One Voice, One Night, where history whispers softly and sleep comes gently. Tonight, we'll take a slow and winding journey, not through fairy tales or fables, but through the strangest truths of medieval royalty. Truths so bizarre, they almost sound made up, but I promise, they're not. So if you're lying in bed, eyes getting heavier, just relax, breathe slowly, let the day fade. And let's begin this strange, sleepy tale about the royal women whose bloodlines weren't branches, but circles, in the quiet halls of castles long forgotten, behind silk curtains and golden tapestries. There lived queens, duchesses, and princesses born into power, but trapped in something far more ancient and unchangeable than thrones. Their names are written in history books: Isabella, Joanna, Maria, and they all had one thing in common. They were born of bloodlines so entangled, so inbred, that their family trees were less like trees, and more like wreaths, looping endlessly back on themselves. In the age of chivalry and courtly love, keeping noble blood pure was not just tradition, it was policy. But the consequences of this obsession with lineage were strange, sometimes tragic, sometimes even laughably absurd. And tonight we'll explore those stories, not with judgment, but with gentle curiosity. Let's go back to the 15th century, to the lands of Spain, Portugal, and the Holy Roman Empire, to a family so infamous for its tangled blood that even centuries later, their name is still whispered with awe: the House of Habsburg. The Habsburgs were powerful, impossibly powerful. They ruled over half of Europe at one point, but to keep that power concentrated, they kept their marriages within the family. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. Sometimes it was even hard to tell who belonged to which generation. And born from these unions were women like Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad. Joanna was born in 1479, the daughter of Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon. She was brilliant, spoke several languages, loved philosophy, and had a curious, imaginative mind. But there was something delicate about her, something fragile. At first, people said she was just sensitive, emotional. Then they said she was unstable. And by the time she was in her 30s, they said she had gone mad. But had she? Or was Joanna simply the tragic product of generations of royal inbreeding? Her parents were cousins, her grandparents were cousins, and her future husband, Philip the Handsome, was her second cousin once removed. Joanna fell desperately in love with Philip. It was a deep, obsessive love. When he died suddenly at the age of 28, Joanna refused to let go. She travelled for months with his coffin, refusing to bury him. She would open the casket to gaze at his face, convinced he would come back to life. Historians debate whether she truly lost her mind, or whether the court simply found her inconvenient. Either way, Joanna spent most of her life locked away in a convent. She never ruled. She never truly lived. She simply existed, alone with her thoughts, her grief, and her haunted bloodline. And Joanna was not the only one. Her story, while tragic, was only the beginning. Because the deeper you go into these royal families, the more tangled the web becomes. There were princesses born with jaws so malformed they couldn't chew. Queens so mentally unstable they believed they were made of glass. And duchesses whose children were born more cousin than stranger. but we'll get to them soon enough. For now, rest your eyes. Let the candlelight of the past flicker softly in your mind, and drift gently as we continue, slowly, quietly, into the next chapter of royal history's strangest bloodlines. As the night deepens, we travel now from Spain to Austria, and into the long looping corridors of Habsburg palaces. The Habsburgs were not just rulers, they were architects, architects of power, of empire, and of bloodlines. But the blueprints they followed weren't linear. They bent, curved, and doubled back on themselves again and again. If Joanna of Castile was one thread in the web, then Maria of Austria was a knot. Maria was born in 1528, the daughter of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and Isabella of Portugal. Both of her parents were grandchildren of the same couple, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Yes, that Ferdinand and Isabella, the ones who funded Columbus. Maria's parents were double first cousins. They shared all four grandparents. Their children had about as much genetic diversity as the offspring of siblings. And yet, Maria was considered beautiful, smart, noble, but her destiny was no less tangled than her lineage. At 19, she was married to her first cousin, Maximilian II, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor. They had 16 children. Many of them were married off to more cousins. The circle tightened. One of Maria's daughters, Anna of Austria, would go on to marry her own uncle, Philip II of Spain. Let that settle for a moment. A daughter married her mother's brother. Genetically speaking, her husband was as close as a father. It was not uncommon in the royal houses of the 16th century. Power mattered more than propriety, and in a world without DNA tests, consequences unfolded slowly, quietly. Anna and Philip had 5 children. 2 survived. Their son, Philip III of Spain, would become king. He was shy, sickly, and prone to long periods of depression. He married his cousin. Their child married another cousin. And so the spiral continued. But perhaps the most infamous result of this spiral was a man whose face became a symbol of royal inbreeding, Charles II of Spain. Charles's mother was Maria Anna of Austria, herself the product of multiple cousin marriages. She was intelligent and dutiful, and she was also her husband's niece. When she gave birth to Charles, people whispered. He had a strangely shaped head, a jaw so oversized it made chewing difficult. He didn't speak until he was 4. He didn't walk until he was 8, and his tongue was so large he often drooled when trying to form words. But he was the king, so they called him Majesty, and looked away. Maria Anna became not only his mother, but his regent, protector, and some said, his shadow ruler. As Charles grew, he was plagued by seizures, infections, and spiritual torment. He believed he was cursed. His advisors blamed witches, and Maria Anna quietly watched her son fade under the weight of centuries of inherited fragility. These weren't monsters. They were people, born into cages gilded with power. Their illnesses weren't punishments, but patterns, echoes of generations who had loved too close. Some tried to break the cycle, some simply accepted it, but none escaped it. And in dim chambers filled with incense and candlelight, daughters were promised to uncles, sisters to cousins, mothers to thrones they could never fully rule. And so the names continue. Maria of Portugal, Margaret of Austria, Isabella Clara Eugenia. Each with a story so strange it almost sounds whispered from a dream. But tonight you'll hear them all, slowly, gently. In the next chapter we'll visit Portugal, where a queen married her cousin, who was already her uncle, and gave birth to a child so fragile, even time seemed afraid to touch him. But for now, let the echoes of palace halls fade. Let the tapestry of bloodlines unwind in your mind, and sleep, if you wish, in the warmth of knowing that even the most powerful were bound by the most human of flaws. The candles are burning low now, the air grows still, and our path leads south toward the shores of Portugal. In a land of ocean breezes and quiet monasteries, there once lived a woman whose name has nearly been forgotten, though the shape of her fate left echoes far louder than her voice. Her name was Maria of Portugal, and her story begins, as so many royal stories do, with a marriage, not of love, but of blood. Maria was born in 1527, a princess of Portugal. Her father was King Manuel I, and her mother was his second wife, who also happened to be his niece. That meant Maria's family tree was already tangled before she was even born. When she came of age, she was married to her first cousin, Philip II of Spain, a man whose blood already matched hers in more ways than one. Their shared grandfather, Ferdinand II, was not just a monarch, but the very centre of a genetic loop that would twist ever tighter as generation followed generation. In time, Maria bore a son. He was named Don Carlos, heir to the Spanish throne, and from the very beginning, he was different. He stumbled when he walked. He stared blankly at servants and nobles alike. He would mutter to himself under his breath and fly into violent rages without warning. At first, the court whispered that he was simply spirited, but those whispers soon grew darker. Don Carlos had inherited the combined weight of generations of inbreeding. The same jaw, the same fragile bones, the same cloudy mind. By the age of 12, he had already fractured his skull in a staircase fall. He suffered fevers, paranoia, and what physicians at the time called melancholy of the blood. Some days he refused to eat. Others he tried to starve himself. And once he attempted to leap from a palace window, screaming that angels were calling him home. Maria of Portugal died young, at just 36 years old. She had watched her son unravel. She had watched her husband turn cold, more ruler than father, more priest than partner. And in the end, even in death, she was remembered not for her kindness, or her piety, or her voice, but for what her womb had created. Don Carlos never ruled. He died at 23, locked in a tower, mad and alone, his blood far purer than his soul could bear. These were the costs of power. Not battles, not taxes, but children, born too close to the fire, with minds like shattered mirrors, and bones too soft to carry crowns. And yet, the cycle continued, because the rules of court were iron, because bloodlines, once looped, are hard to unwind, and because the fear of outsiders was always stronger than the fear of illness. Maria of Portugal was not the first to marry her cousin. She would not be the last. In the centuries to come, more women would be born into these gilded cages. Some would smile and pretend not to notice. Others would break slowly, quietly. In the next chapter, we'll visit Margaret of Austria, a woman whose life was filled with funerals, but whose letters reveal the deep loneliness of a heart trapped by duty. And we'll follow the story of Isabella Clara Eugenia, daughter of the mad Joanna, whose life was haunted not by war, but by memories she could never quite silence. But for now, just close your eyes, breathe deep, and drift through the halls of time, where queens wept in silence, and history tiptoes behind velvet curtains. The night is quiet now, the wind has faded, and somewhere in the distance a church bell rings once, and then again, calling out to no one. Let us walk softly now into the story of a woman who wore black not just in mourning, but for the rest of her life. Her name was Margaret of Austria. Margaret was born in 1480, a daughter of the mighty Habsburg house. She was promised in marriage before she could speak. Her father, Maximilian I, arranged her first engagement when she was just 2 years old. By the time she turned 10, she was sent away to France to be raised as the bride of a prince. But when politics shifted, her engagement was broken. She was sent home, a child, already rejected. Later, she married John of Castile, heir to the Spanish throne. They were married only a few months before he died of illness, or poison, depending on who you ask. Margaret never remarried. She wore black for the rest of her days. Even as she governed the Netherlands with wisdom and strength, she refused to wear colour. Not red, not blue, not gold, only black. Her palace was silent. She filled it with books, music, and letters. She wrote long, aching poems. She said once, "I have been betrothed, wed, widowed, and regent, but I have never been free." Her family loved her for her loyalty, but they also used her. She was an aunt to kings, a sister to emperors, a piece on the board, moved often, never asked. But while Margaret surrounded herself with art and intellect, another woman of royal blood was raised inside shadows. Her name was Isabella Clara Eugenia, the daughter of Joanna the Mad and granddaughter of Isabella of Castile. Isabella Clara was born in 1566, a time of war, empire, and religious chaos. Her mother, Joanna, had been locked away for decades, whispering to her dead husband's ghost. Her father, Philip II of Spain, ruled with an iron hand, cold, pious, and distant. And so Isabella Clara was raised by nuns, by tutors, by servants who spoke only in whispers. She grew up surrounded by religious art, silence, and rules. No toys, no laughter, only prayers and duty. And yet, she blossomed. She learned Latin, philosophy, music, and painting. She became a skilled diplomat, a voice of calm in a world of storms. When she came of age, her father sent her north to rule the Spanish Netherlands with her husband, who also happened to be her cousin. His name was Archduke Albert. The marriage was arranged, as always, but something rare happened. They grew to love each other. Together they ruled kindly. They walked among the poor. They funded schools and cathedrals. And when Albert died, Isabella Clara dressed in black, and like her great-aunt Margaret, she never took it off again. She ruled alone for 20 years, with strength, with grace, and always with silence about her mother, Joanna. No one knows what Isabella Clara truly thought of her family's history, of the madness, the close marriages, the looped bloodlines. She never spoke of her mother's madness. She never questioned her father's decisions. But once, in a private letter, she wrote to a nun she trusted, "My heart is heavy, and my blood is tired. Sometimes I think it carries too much memory. A tired blood, a quiet ache, passed from mother to daughter, again and again." And still it continued. One by one, more daughters were born into these royal circles. Daughters who would marry uncles, cousins, even brothers. Daughters whose names faded, but whose pain echoed through time. In the next chapter, we'll follow one of the most infamous women of all, Marie Antoinette. Yes, that Marie Antoinette, but not the one you think you know, because her story too begins with a family tree that folded in on itself and ended with a crown and a blade. But not tonight. Tonight, you rest. Let Margaret's mourning and Isabella's silence softly fade from your thoughts. Let the night carry them away, like petals falling into still water. And sleep knowing that history, even when twisted, can be remembered gently. The fire burns low. The castle walls have changed, but the names remain. Tonight, we open the heavy doors of the 18th century. The wigs grow taller, the gowns grow wider, but behind the powdered faces and chandeliers, the same blood still pulses, slow, familiar, and closed. Our story now turns to a girl born not into power, but into its final echo. Her name was Marie Antoinette. She was born in 1755 in the Imperial Palace of Vienna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa and Emperor Francis I. Her mother ruled an empire. Her father ruled beside her. And around little Marie, the halls were filled with whispers, plans, and lace. But while the world would one day call her French, Marie was pure Habsburg. Her blood carried the weight of centuries. She was descended from Joanna the Mad, from Charles V, from Maximilian and Maria, those same cousins of cousins who had spun their lineage into a perfect golden cage. By the time Marie was born, the Habsburg family had folded in on itself so many times that her genetic code was a mirror of the past, and the reflection was not always kind. Marie was lovely, but fragile. She learned music, but not much reading. She danced, but couldn't concentrate. Her tutors found her sweet, but slow. Not dull, but scattered. They said she smiled too often, that she didn't listen. But perhaps she just couldn't hear through the noise in her blood. At 14, she was married off to Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France, heir to the Bourbon throne. It was not love, it was politics. Austria and France had been enemies. Now they would be family. The girl who spoke broken French and played the harp was now the future Queen of France. But France was not kind to her. They laughed at her accent. They mocked her gowns. They whispered about her body. And her husband was cold, quiet, and strange. For 7 years they shared a bed, but no child. Whispers turned to rumours that she was barren, that she was unfaithful, that she was not a real woman. But the truth, as always, was stranger. Historians now believe that Louis XVI may have had a condition, a malformed anatomy, another quiet consequence of centuries of royal intermarriage. Eventually, they would produce children, but the damage to her name had already been done. Marie Antoinette became a queen at 19, a mother at 23, and a prisoner at 37. But through it all, she remained a daughter of the Habsburg line. She spent hours writing letters to her family in Vienna, to her mother, to her siblings, to those who shared her blood, even if they were hundreds of miles away. She asked for advice. She asked for comfort. She asked to come home. But she never did. When the revolution came, Marie was a symbol of wealth, of waste, of tyranny. But beneath the powdered hair and diamonds was a woman who had never chosen any of it. She was born into a system already crumbling. The blood she carried was royal, yes, but also tired. It had looped too many times. It had broken too many daughters. And in her, it met its end. On October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was executed by guillotine. She was 37. They say she walked to the scaffold with dignity. They say she whispered an apology when she stepped on the foot of her executioner. And then the line ended. But the story does not end with a blade, because while Marie's line ended in France, others lived on. In Austria, in Spain, in Portugal. Women were still being born into these royal houses, still being married to their cousins, still carrying the same weary blood. In the next chapter, we'll meet one of the very last, Archduchess Maria Theresa of Austria-Este, a woman born with a title and a curse, whose story closes the book on centuries of royal inbreeding. But for now, close your eyes. Let Marie's story fade into candlelight, and sleep, knowing that even queens, with gowns and diamonds and palaces, are still just daughters, born into someone else's dream. The night is deep now. Even the wind seems to have paused, as if it too is listening. The palace halls have grown quieter, and the voices that once filled them, of kings and queens, of lovers and ministers, have turned to echoes. We now enter the final pages of a story that spanned centuries, and standing near the end is a woman whose name few now recall, Archduchess Maria Theresa of Austria-Este. Not the Empress Maria Theresa of the 18th century, but her namesake, born in 1773, just 2 decades before the French Revolution would turn Europe's palaces into prisons. Maria Theresa was born into a world unravelling. Her family was noble, almost impossibly so. She was the daughter of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria and Maria Beatrice d'Este, 2 members of royal bloodlines that had already overlapped, twisted, and folded inward for generations. From birth, Maria Theresa's life was ceremonial. She was watched, praised, prepared, but the empire around her was trembling. The ideals of the Enlightenment had swept through Europe, and with them came whispers that maybe blood was not destiny, but in her house, blood was still everything. At 20, Maria Theresa was married to Victor Emmanuel I, King of Sardinia, and, of course, her cousin. Their union was meant to strengthen the collapsing alliance between the Austrian Empire and the House of Savoy. But all it did was bind 2 dying lines even tighter. They had 7 children. Only 4 survived infancy. 1 was deaf. 1 had chronic seizures. Another would later describe fits of melancholy so deep, I feared my mind would slip away. The daughters of Maria Theresa were known for their beauty, their soft features, their pale complexions, their delicate health. They were called porcelain princesses by courtiers, fragile, lovely, and quietly broken. By the mid-1800s, the world had changed. Revolutions came and went, monarchies fell, and the old names, Habsburg, Bourbon, Savoy, sounded more like stories than rulers. Maria Theresa died in 1832, not by sword, not by blade, but by illness, slow, unnamed, and quiet. She was buried beside her husband. Her tomb bore a title, but not the truth. Because by the time she passed, her family's power had withered. Their lands were broken, their bloodlines spent. The daughters of the Habsburgs, the Joannas, the Marias, the Isabellas, had lived through centuries of castles, candles, and contracts signed in blood. They were born to reign. But instead, they inherited silence, illness, and a deep, unspoken sadness. Not all were mad, not all were deformed, but all of them, in some way, carried the echoes of a choice made long ago, to keep bloodlines pure, to marry within, to pass on titles, and also the burden. And still the world remembers them. sometimes with scorn, sometimes with fascination. But tonight we remember them gently. In the next chapter, we won't speak of queens or princesses, but of what's remained, the legends, the rumours, the myths that followed them, of ghost stories whispered in Spanish cathedrals, of portraits that age and crack but never fade, of names no longer spoken aloud but written in old, locked books. But for now, let your thoughts drift from the marble tombs and velvet thrones. Let the last daughter sleep, and you too, close your eyes. Let the past rest for a while, beneath layers of lace, stone, and time. The night has grown still. The world outside your window is quiet, but the world of memory still stirs. There is something strange about places that held too much sorrow. Old castles, empty chapels, portraits that seem to follow you with their eyes. When the last breath leaves a royal bloodline, what remains behind? Tonight, we wander into the shadows, not of people, but of presence, of stories passed down not in books, but in whispers. In the convent of Tordesillas, where Joanna the Mad spent the final 46 years of her life, the nuns say they still hear her. Not in voice, but in feeling. They say the chapel grows colder at midnight, that the candle flames flicker when no wind blows, and that sometimes a scent of dried roses lingers in the halls, the kind Joanna used to wear in her hair when she still believed she was a queen. Her coffin lies sealed, but her legend is not. Visitors say they feel watched. Some refuse to enter her room. And though no portraits remain of her in the convent, one mirror, ancient and cracked, is always found turned to the wall. No one knows why. The Habsburgs, whose blood wove through so many daughters, were whispered to be cursed. In the 17th century, a monk named Father Gaspar wrote, "The house of Austria shall be mighty in name, but dwindled in soul. Their sons shall be weak, their daughters weep, and no crown shall heal their blood." After Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, died childless, some said the curse had finally claimed its last heir. Others believed it had only changed form, passing not through blood, but through paintings, books, and stone. In an old palace in Vienna, a portrait of Maria of Portugal once hung in a forgotten corridor. She wears a dark green gown, her eyes are soft, and she's holding a rose, the flower her mad son used to crush in his sleep. Over the centuries, the painting was moved, restored, and eventually lost. But those who worked at the palace said the frame never gathered dust, that even when left untouched for years it remained spotless. One caretaker reported that he once found the portrait on the floor, face down, though no one had touched it in weeks. Another said he dreamed of Maria standing at the foot of his bed, silent, watching, waiting. They took the portrait down. No one remembers where it went. But some say, late at night, the smell of pressed flowers returns to that corridor, as if someone still walks there. Maybe it's just stories. Maybe it's just the creaking of old wood and the mind's desire to find meaning in silence. But maybe, just maybe, some grief is too heavy to leave quietly. The women of royal blood were not just born to marry and obey. They dreamed. They mourned. They wrote in diaries no one read. They sang lullabies no one recorded. They carried hopes, strange, beautiful, unfinished. And when their bodies turned to dust, their stories whispered on. In the next chapter, we will leave the ghosts behind and return to the living world to examine how modern science came to understand what royal families refused to see. What did inbreeding truly do to the body and the mind? What happens when genetics become repetition? And how did the bloodlines of queens long gone become lessons written in biology books? But for now, rest. The sky is still. The world outside is distant now, as if we've wandered too deep into time to return just yet. And in this quiet space between history and memory, we open a gentler door. The door of understanding. For centuries, people spoke of madness, melancholy, or delicate health, as if they were curses or the will of God. But today we understand a little more. We know that blood carries more than just names. It carries codes, instructions, and sometimes errors. When cousins marry cousins, when families turn inward for too long, the pool of genetic diversity shrinks. In scientific terms, this is called consanguinity, a word that simply means your blood is closer than it should be. When both parents carry the same silent mutation, the child has a higher chance of inheriting two copies of that defect. And when this happens, the body forgets how to repair itself. Bones may grow soft, organs may fail to form, brains may develop differently. And so, what medieval people once called unbalanced humours, or demonic possession, we now understand as the quiet result of repeated genetic echoes. Joanna the Mad may have suffered from bipolar disorder, exacerbated by the genetic closeness of her parents. Charles II of Spain, with his misshapen jaw and mental delays, was found, through DNA reconstruction, to have an inbreeding coefficient higher than that of a child born to siblings. His family tree looked less like a tree and more like a circle. His body had no strength. His mind struggled to connect. And yet he was king, because no one dared to break the chain. Modern medicine now knows that inbreeding increases risk for over 1,200 known genetic disorders, and the closer the relatives, the higher the risk. In the general population, such conditions are rare, but in royal houses, where generation after generation married within, they became common. Soft bones, club feet, heart defects, seizures, mental illness, infertility. Not because they were royal, but because they were never allowed to be anything else. It is not cruelty that history teaches us, it is caution. Because even in palaces of gold, even in carriages of velvet, no one escapes biology. The queens, the duchesses, the daughters. They followed the rules. They obeyed. But their bodies silently kept the score. And when the final daughters were born, with weak lungs and tired eyes, they carried not just tiaras and titles, but generations of quiet suffering. But even in this, there is something human, something tender, because many of these women still lived. They wrote, laughed, loved, and mourned. They were more than vessels for bloodlines. They were people, just like you, just like me. In the next chapter, we'll return to their voices through letters, diaries, and forgotten quotes, and hear what they wanted to say beneath the silence of protocol and duty. There is something sacred about a letter never meant to be read aloud. Something tender in words whispered to paper when no one else is listening. Long before microphones and memoirs, royal women often found their only freedom in ink. They were queens, yes, but also daughters, sisters, wives, and above all, human beings longing to be heard. Tonight, we open a few of those letters, not to expose them, but to honour the quiet truths that history often forgets. I have ruled in the name of men all my life, yet I've never ruled my own hours. I miss the scent of orange blossoms. I miss the sea. I wonder what my voice would sound like if I ever used it only for myself. Margaret of Austria. She wrote this near the end of her life, in a quiet palace in Mechlin, where the walls were lined with books and the halls with silence. No one read that line until a century later. But tonight, you've heard it. My mother once spoke to the walls, but I think she was simply tired of silence. I often wonder what words died in her throat when she was told to be still. Isabella Clara Eugenia. It was written in the margin of a psalter. A passing note. A daughter writing to no one. Farewell, my kind and tender sister. I embrace you with all my heart. Never again shall I see you in this world, but may our souls meet again in a better one. Marie Antoinette, October 1793. She wrote this 2 days before her execution. She addressed it to Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law. The letter was smuggled out. It was meant to be burned, but someone kept it. And tonight, so have we. They call us the blue-blooded, but what is the colour of a bruise? Author unknown, circa 1720, Vienna archives. Some say it came from a lady in waiting. Others say it was penned by a young princess who died before her wedding day. We'll never know, but the words remain. These women were not just symbols, not just names etched into marble. They felt joy. They feared aging. They longed for children. They missed home. They lived behind curtains. And they died behind veils. And yet somehow, their voices found their way here, to us, to tonight. In the final chapter, we will step back, not into the past, but into the present. We'll ask what these stories mean now, why we still remember these women, and what we might carry forward from their strange, sad, and beautiful lives. And now, here we are, at the quiet edge of history, not with a bang, but with a breath. We have walked the candlelit corridors of palaces. We have stood beside silent portraits. We have listened to letters, never meant to be read aloud. And what have we found? Not monsters, not myths, not royalty untouched by time, but women, real women, born into strange shapes of power and stranger shapes of family. History often remembers the kings, their wars, their treaties, their victories carved in stone. But beneath those banners were the women who carried the blood forward, who bled quietly in childbirth, who married cousins they'd never met, who wore silk and smiled in portraits, even as their bodies betrayed them. They were not allowed to speak loudly, but they endured, in bone, in memory, in paper, and now in you. Joanna the Mad, who carried love too far and grief even farther. Maria of Portugal, whose womb bore a fragile prince, and whose sorrow went unspoken. Margaret of Austria, who ruled wisely, but was never asked what she wanted. Isabella Clara Eugenia, who dressed in black, but governed with light. Marie Antoinette, the queen we thought we knew, but never truly listened to. And finally, Maria Theresa of Austria-Este, one of the last, born at the end of a story that had already run too long. What do their lives mean now, in a world without thrones? What do we do with their pain, their silence, their strange and sorrowful beauty? Perhaps we remember, not to repeat. Perhaps we tell their stories not to glorify power, but to recognize its cost. Because even the mightiest bloodlines can collapse from within. Because even a crown cannot protect a heart. And because even a princess can dream of something more than duty. So now, dear listener, let them rest. Let Joanna's voice fall silent. Let Maria's perfume fade. Let the letters close themselves again. Let the candles burn out one by one. And let sleep come. Not like a curtain drawn, but like a page turned, softly, slowly, to something new. Good night.